In October 2004, 6 men carried Courtney Coco's coffin to her grave, and one of them had killed her. Nobody in that cemetery knew it. Her mother didn't know it, her sister didn't know it, and her sister was engaged to him. He had been part of this family for years, close enough that when police finally needed a name to write beneath cause of death, this man was the last person anyone considered. 3 days before that funeral, a stranger driving a tractor past an abandoned building in Winnie, Texas, noticed a smell he would never forget. Inside, he found a 19-year-old woman's body, left in a position that made investigators believe someone wanted her found that way. She had no ID on her, no wallet, nothing that could tell them who she was, except a small gold-class ring on her finger, engraved with her name. That ring is the only reason anyone knew who she was. It would not be the only thing it told them. For 16 years, the man who killed Courtney Coco stood beside the people who loved her most. He carried her coffin. He drove 3 hours to the place her body was dumped and helped place a handmade cross there, a memorial to a woman he had murdered with his own hands. He sat across from detectives more than once. He was never the first name on anyone's list. What finally undid him wasn't a confession. It wasn't new forensic technology, and it wasn't a deathbed admission. It was a retired detective with a podcast, a witness with a photographic memory who drew a stranger's face from a 15-year-old memory, and 2 men who remembered exactly what David Anthony Burns told them while he was drunk, years before anyone thought to ask. This is The Case Collector, and by the end of this case, you'll understand exactly how a man can bury someone with one hand and hold their family together with the other. If you have not subscribed yet, now is the time. This is where we cover the cases the headlines never told you the full story of. Also, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Courtney Megan Coco was born March 30th, 1985, in Alexandria, Louisiana, the youngest of 3 girls raised by her mother, Stephanie Bellegarde, alongside her sisters, Heather and Lace. Her father, Gregory Warbington, died while Courtney was still young, a loss her family has said shaped her in lasting ways. It may be part of why she leaned so hard on her mother growing up, why a daily phone call mattered as much as it did. It may also be part of why, once she was old enough, independence became something she chased deliberately, rather than something that simply happened to her. People who knew her as a kid described the same thing over and over. She didn't sit still. She played softball. She was a cheerleader. She threw herself into whatever was in front of her with a kind of restless energy that her family said never really faded, even as she got older and quieter in other ways. By high school, that energy had narrowed into something more specific. Courtney graduated from Alexandria Senior High School in 2003 and enrolled at Northwestern State University in Natchitoches, about an hour and a half from home. She chose to study criminal investigations. There is no evidence Courtney ever imagined her own name would end up in a case file, but it's worth sitting with, for a moment, that the last thing she was building toward, the degree, the direction, the future, was the exact field that would spend the next 16 years failing to give her family an answer. She didn't wait for college to start building a life. Courtney took a job at a local dental office to support herself, and not long after, she moved into her own apartment on West Sandy Bayou, a decision her mother later said was entirely in character. Courtney liked being independent. She liked having her own space, her own car, her own schedule, even while she stayed wrapped up in her family's daily life. Her closest friend was a young woman named Jackie, and through Jackie, Courtney had grown close to Jackie's boyfriend, Louis. The 3 of them spent a lot of time together, nothing unusual, nothing that stood out. Just the ordinary rhythm of 3 young people in a small Louisiana city, killing time at each other's houses, running errands together, showing up for each other without much planning involved. That rhythm would matter more than anyone realized, because the very last people to see Courtney Coco alive were Jackie and Louis, and the very last night of her life looked, in every way, like all the ones before it. By the fall of 2004, Courtney was 19 years old, working, studying, building something for herself, one semester at a time. Her family described her as the kind of person who checked in, who called her mother just to talk, who showed up when she said she would. That reliability is part of why, when it broke, Everyone around her noticed almost immediately. She had no way of knowing how soon that would happen. By October 2004, David Anthony Burns was not a stranger standing at the edge of Courtney Coco's life. He was inside it. Burns had been engaged to Courtney's older sister, Lace, for 6 years by that point. 6 years is not a fling. 6 years is holidays, arguments, family dinners, the kind of relationship that stops being new and starts being structural, the kind where nobody in the family remembers a version of things without him in it. He wasn't the boyfriend everyone was still deciding about. He was already family, in every way that mattered, except the paperwork. People who are engaged for 6 years to someone's daughter tend to know things. They know the family's routines, their schedules, who's home and who isn't on a given weekend. They get keys, they get trust. Nobody in Courtney's life had reason, in 2004, to think twice about how much David Burns knew about their lives, because that's what 6 years earns you. Burns was in his mid-20s that fall, from Boyce, Louisiana, a small community not far from Alexandria, the kind of place where reputations travel fast and everyone tends to know everyone else's business. If you had asked anyone in Alexandria that October to name someone capable of what would come out 16 years later, David Burns would not have been on that list, not near the top, not anywhere on it. That consistency would turn out to be the most useful thing he owned. Nothing about David Burns, in the fall of 2004, marked him as separate from the family he was about to become permanently entangled with, for reasons no one in that house could have imagined yet. He was Lace's fiancé. He was, as far as anyone around Courtney Coco was concerned, one of them. Whatever else was happening beneath that, whatever else was true about David Burns that October, none of it was visible yet. Not to Lace, not to Stephanie Bellegarde, not to Courtney. On the night of October 1st, 2004, Courtney Coco spent her evening the way she spent most nights that fall, with her closest friend, Jackie, and Jackie's boyfriend, Louis. The three of them gathered at Courtney's apartment on West Sandy Bayou in Alexandria, Louisiana, and played dominoes. Nothing about the night stood out. No argument, no tension, nothing anyone would later describe as unusual. Around 2 o'clock to 2:30 the following morning, now October 2nd, Courtney drove Jackie and Louis home. That was the last time either of them saw her. Phone records would later show one final piece of activity from Courtney's cell phone at approximately 4:30 a.m. that same morning. After that, nothing. No calls, no texts, no answered messages. Courtney Coco simply stopped. When investigators eventually got inside her apartment, there was no sign of forced entry, no broken lock, no damaged door, nothing to suggest a stranger had pushed his way in. What they did find was smaller, and in some ways more unsettling. Her jeans and her shoes, left on her bedroom floor. For 2 days, nobody outside her immediate circle knew anything was wrong. Then, on the evening of October 3rd, roughly 200 miles away in Winnie, Texas, a local resident named Jude Wilson was driving near an abandoned building just off Interstate 10. Around 10 o'clock that night, a car backed out of the property directly into his path, close enough that he nearly collided with it. He saw someone step in front of the headlights. At the time, it meant nothing to him. It was just a strange moment on an ordinary drive home. He had no idea, that night, that he had just become the most important witness in a case that hadn't happened yet, not as far as the law was concerned. Courtney's body hadn't even been found. That changed the next morning. On October 4th, at approximately 8:30 a.m., a farmer driving a tractor past that same abandoned building noticed a smell he couldn't place and looked over. Chambers County Patrol Deputy Tommy Henry responded within 5 minutes of the call. Inside the building, he found the body of a young woman, nude from the waist down, lying on her back. She had no ID, no wallet, nothing on her that could immediately say who she was, except a small gold class ring on her finger. Engraved inside it, her name and the words, Alexandria Sr. That ring told investigators exactly who she was. It told them nothing about who had put her there. About a week later, Courtney's car turned up in Houston, Texas. Her belongings were still inside it. including the white lab coat she wore to her job at the dental office. Whoever had driven that car to Houston had left almost everything behind. Almost everything. What was left behind in that car gave Alexandria investigators, led by Sergeant Cedric Green, almost nothing to work with. Fingerprints, yes, but so many overlapping prints from so many different people who'd cycled through that abandoned vehicle on the streets of Houston that no single profile could be isolated. The trunk offered more. Investigators recovered dried staining consistent with blood, later confirmed to be Courtney's. That detail mattered for a reason that went beyond identifying whose blood it was. Courtney's body, when it was found in Winnie, was in a state of decomposition that struck investigators as too advanced for the 2 days she'd been missing, until they considered where she might have spent part of that time. A car trunk, sealed, sitting in the Texas heat, accelerates decomposition dramatically. It gave investigators a working theory. She hadn't died in that abandoned building. She'd been brought there. That theory gave police a shape for the case. It did not give them a name. In the earliest days of the investigation, detectives worked through a list of people who had been close to Courtney in the months before she disappeared. One name was Floyd Williams, a man she dated on and off. The final outgoing call from her cell phone that October morning had gone to a woman connected to him. He was questioned at length and eventually cleared, along with several others in Courtney's circle. None of it led anywhere. Years passed. Leads were followed and closed. Suspects were questioned and released. The case that Stephanie Bellegarde had sworn, at her daughter's grave, that she would not let go cold, went cold anyway, the way most cases like it eventually do, not from lack of effort, but from lack of anything new to work with. And through all of it, through the years of dead ends, through every re-interview and every rechecked file, David Anthony Burns remained exactly where he'd always been, inside the family. He had carried Courtney's coffin at her funeral. He had traveled to that abandoned building in Winnie, Texas, and helped place a handmade cross at the spot where her body was found. He mourned her, publicly and repeatedly, for years, as the man who killed her. It's worth stopping here, because this is the detail that makes David Burns different from the kind of killer most true crime cases produce. This wasn't a man who disappeared after the crime, who cut ties, who avoided the family out of guilt or fear of suspicion. He did the opposite. He stayed close. He performed grief convincingly enough, for long enough, that nobody around him ever had reason to question it. That pattern shows up again in how the crime scene itself was handled. Investigators came to believe Courtney's body had been deliberately positioned to suggest a sexual assault, a staged scene meant to send detectives looking in the wrong direction. That takes a kind of composure, not panic, calculation. Compare that composure to what came out years later, when two separate acquaintances told police that Burns had described killing Courtney to them while he was drinking, casually, almost boastfully. One of them, Waylon Durison, said Burns told him that taking a life ain't as hard as you think. That is not the language of guilt. It's the language of a man who had made peace with what he'd done a long time ago. There's a second layer to that control worth naming. Performing grief at a funeral is one thing. A single day, a single act, surrounded by people who want to believe you. Burns sustained something far harder, nearly 2 decades of ordinary contact, family gatherings, holidays, sitting, more than once, across from detectives who had every reason to look at him and never quite getting caught in a contradiction that stuck. His own defense attorney, Christopher LaCour, would later argue the state's case was built on witnesses who kept contradicting themselves. Burns, notably, never did, not in any way that made it into a police report or a courtroom transcript. Whatever else is true about him, he was consistent for 19 years in a way almost no one else involved in this case managed to be. Whether that composure came from remorselessness or from genuine emotional attachment to the family he stayed close to is something investigators never fully resolved, and it's a question the case never definitively answers. In October 2018, Detective Tanner Dryden of the Alexandria Police Department was assigned to take another look at the file. A year later, exhausted by 14 years without an answer, Stephanie Bellegarde reached out to a retired homicide detective turned podcast host named Woody Overton. Overton began digging into a case that had already outlived most people's attention span for it, and within weeks, his investigation was producing something the case hadn't had in over a decade: new tips. The tips that came in after Woody Overton's podcast went public weren't rumors. Two of them were people who had been sitting on the truth for close to a decade. The first was Waylon Durison, a man who had known David Burns for 25 to 30 years. Durison's account of what Burns told him in 2011 became one of the most damaging pieces of testimony in the entire trial, not because it was new information by 2019, but because for the first time, someone was willing to repeat it to the right people, on the record. By the time Durison agreed to testify, his own life had taken a hard turn. He was living in a homeless shelter in Missouri, and investigators had to arrange to bring him back to Louisiana just to put him on the stand. It's the kind of detail a defense attorney can use to attack credibility, and Christopher LaCour did exactly that. But it's also the kind of detail that raises its own question. Why would a struggling man with nothing left to gain volunteer a story that put him back in a courtroom, under oath, against someone he'd known for decades? A second associate came forward independently, around the same time, describing a nearly identical conversation with Burns from roughly the same period. Two men, two separate accounts, the same story. Then there was Jude Wilson. Wilson had told police, back in 2004, what he'd seen outside that abandoned building in Winnie. For years, that statement sat in a file, unremarkable, unconfirmed, one detail among hundreds. What investigators didn't know until 2019 was that Wilson had an unusually precise memory, and that he was also a trained illustrator. 15 years after the fact, Wilson sat down and drew a silhouette of the man he'd seen step in front of those headlights. When Detective Tanner Dryden's team put together a photo lineup, Wilson picked David Anthony Burns. His account was independently corroborated. A Chambers County Sheriff's Office employee who had been on that same road that same night confirmed the timeline and the near collision Wilson described, even before Wilson connected it to the case. At trial, Special Assistant District Attorney Hugo Holland put Wilson's 15-year-old sketch on a courtroom screen, side by side with home video footage of Burns. The resemblance was close enough that Holland was able to lay one image over the other in front of the jury. The state also called a crime scene reconstruction expert, who testified that bodies are sometimes deliberately posed for one of a few reasons: to demean the victim, to create shock, or as an act of revenge. It was expert language for something the jury had already been shown, that whoever left Courtney in that building wanted her found exactly the way she was found. The defense, in its single witness, called a forensic pathologist who argued the original toxicology work didn't tell the full story, and that alcohol alone could account for more of what was found in Courtney's system than prosecutors were crediting. It was the closest the defense came to offering an alternative explanation for her death, and it wasn't enough to outweigh what the jury had already heard. On April 13, 2021, a Rapides Parish grand jury indicted David Anthony Burns on charges of second-degree murder. He was arrested that same day, more than 16 years after Courtney Coco's body was found. The trial began in late October 2022. Over 3 days, the state called its witnesses: Durison, the second associate; Jude Wilson, forensic experts; the original responding officers. Burns's defense, led by attorney Christopher LaCour, called one witness in return. LaCour's strategy centered on discrediting the state's case as a pattern of inconsistency, pointing out that Wilson himself had, at different points, given conflicting dates for the night he saw the car. It wasn't enough. On October 31, 2022, the jury returned a unanimous verdict after just 90 minutes of deliberation: guilty of second-degree murder. LaCour would later call it a gut punch, and argue publicly that the jury had been swayed by sympathy rather than evidence. Whether that's true is not something this case will ever settle for either side. What isn't in dispute is the verdict itself and what came next. On November 29, 2022, a judge sentenced David Anthony Burns to life in prison without the possibility of parole, probation, or suspension of sentence. Burns appealed, arguing the evidence against him was entirely circumstantial. On December 6, 2023, the Louisiana Third Circuit Court of Appeal disagreed, affirming both his conviction and his sentence. As of today, David Anthony Burns remains incarcerated at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola, serving that sentence. For 19 years, the only object that could speak for Courtney Coco was a small gold ring, engraved with her name, found on a body no one could otherwise identify. It carried her name through a police report, through an autopsy table, through 19 years of dead ends and false starts, and a trial that almost didn't happen. It never once pointed to who killed her. That was never its job. Its job was simply to make sure that whatever else this case became, a cold case, a podcast, a courtroom argument, it never stopped, at its center, being about her. Not every question in this case closed with the verdict. DNA recovered from the latch of Courtney's car trunk belonged to a man named Landry, never charged, his connection to the case never fully explained. A separate witness placed another man, identified only as Ernest Veal, behind the wheel of Courtney's car in the days after she disappeared. And Courtney's own sister, Lace, engaged to Burns for 6 years, the person closest to him in the world, has never publicly detailed what she may have suspected, or when. None of that amounts to evidence of anyone else's guilt. It also hasn't gone away. Whether David Anthony Burns acted entirely alone that night is a question this case has never definitively answered. If this case meant something to you, sharing it costs nothing and helps this story reach the people who need to hear it. Drop your verdict below. I'll see you on the next case.